Hello and welcome. I'm Maria Ressa, and sitting with us today is Indonesia's Trade Minister, Tom Lembong. Minister Lembong, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I have to tell people, I feel like I have seen you from the very beginning. When you were in your 20s, you left a very high-paying job with Morgan Stanley, with Deutsche Bank as an investment banker, and you joined the bank restructuring firm IBRA. Where is that man, the idealism that you had then, and the man now who left his private sector company to become the trade minister?
Well, still the same old guy. I'm still same old Tom. I always ask people to still call me Tom, not Mr. Minister or Your Excellency. That's terrible. There are times in your life when the higher purpose is calling, and I think it would be foolish to ignore opportunities like that. One can do so much, right? I think the difference now versus that was already more than 15 years ago.
Yeah.
I would have to admit I've mellowed. I used to be much more firebrand.
Right.
And
I remember telling you were crazy back then.
Well, that probably hasn't changed, right? I think to make life fulfilling, to make life fun, you have to be a little bit crazy, right? You can't always opt for the safe and steady. You have to go out on a limb once in a while and just take a chance.
When you say you've mellowed, though, this is reality versus the
Right.
idealism that you had. What's changed in you since then?
Well, I've had some challenging times, and I think even some pretty devastating failures, to be honest. But it was great because it taught me humility. Before, maybe I was always more keen to talk and show off, how smart I am. But afterwards, I realized that actually the most important thing in life is to be a good listener, right? And so I think these days I'm usually much more keen to open my ears wide and take in as much as possible. I think over time one learns to put aside one's ego, right? And so even criticism doesn't really faze me. And it's funny, I've had situations where some of my fiercest critics ultimately became very good friends because just one thing, and that is a willingness, I think a sincere willingness to listen.
So the other thing that was always fascinating about you is that you come from both worlds. The Harvard-educated investment banker,
Right.
and yet the fiercely Indonesian man. How have you grown? This was one of the topics of our
Right.
conversations all the time. How do you put that together? How have you grown in this, and how do you, as the
Right.
trade minister, put this
Right.
together?
Well, I think probably have to answer that with a bit of a paradox, right? I think on the one hand, I believe that national and ethnic differences are often so exaggerated. At bottom, even across vast different cultures, all people appreciate sincerity. All people appreciate kindness and respect. People may have different ways of showing it. Some cultures tend to be more gregarious, some cultures tend to be more subdued, but I think there's something strangely human underneath all of us, and real sincerity, real respect, real, dare I say, love. I think people are able to detect that across cultural divides. Now, on the other hand, over time I've become even more appreciative of the things that make Indonesian culture so unique. And look, Indonesia is an archipelago island in the middle
Yeah.
of Asia Pacific, right, between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And for centuries, we've been hosting sailors and merchants that come from Portugal and Holland and Spain and the UK, passing through on their way to East Asia. Arabs, Indian merchants that brought Islam, to Indonesia, and on the other direction, Chinese merchants, Japanese merchants on their way to the Middle East. So I believe our culture is very diverse and very welcoming, very open. For a richly endowed tropical country, we're very self-confident, very relaxed, practical, in contrast to other potentially more homogeneous or monolithic cultures. And there's certain strength in being homogeneous and monolithic, absolutely. But the world needs both.
Right.
The world benefits from having both. And, I've come to more greatly appreciate our strengths, which is our diversity, our tolerance for difference, right? Our openness to new things and foreign things. And I think our economic strategy, our national strategy should be rooted, very deeply in our centuries-long culture.
You're talking about tolerance and unity and diversity. I mean, again, a different way of the U.S. has the e pluribus unum, right? I mean, all under one. And I guess Indonesia has had its fair share of dealing with intolerance. It certainly understands the terrorism threat. It was a theater of operations for Jemaah Islamiyah, Al-Qaeda's arm. What's your reaction to the terror attacks in Paris and the potential threat it has for the region?
Well, obviously, the tragic events in Paris are absolutely appalling. I think I don't want to repeat what most leaders around the world have already been saying, right? Just want to add maybe my personal spin or view on the situation.
Please.
Looking at the roots of the issue, I do worry that one of our top enemies ought to be cynicism, right? And I think a lot of times we, technocratic leaders, bureaucratic leaders, take a cynical approach, right, to leading or to policymaking. And I think it does more than its fair share to cause disillusionment. Again, I think across cultures, people can detect when you're not being sincere, when you're being cynical, and you're not really telling the truth. You're not being genuine, like you don't genuinely care, or you're not genuinely looking out for your people. I mean, it's now coming out that some of the terrorists who perpetrated these terrible atrocities in Paris were well-educated, middle-class, French-born, right? So yes, I do believe there is a correlation between poverty and extremism and radicalism. There is a correlation between poor education and being vulnerable to extremist teachings. But again, similar to September 11,
yes,
some of the perpetrators are well-off, middle-class, well-educated. And again, I worry that if we globally, as leaders, perpetrate too much cynicism in the way we lead, in the way we make policy, in the way we address issues, people can tell, and it causes them to become disaffected and turn towards other potential sources of genuine truth, right?
How many people believe the way you do? I mean, in general, many of the policymakers tend to be more defensive, protectionist in economic language. How many are like you, and how difficult is it to put this into policy?
What becomes very interesting to me is we may be at a crucial generational transition, right? And let's look at two of the largest societies in the APEC community, China and Indonesia. You have two new leaders, President Xi Jinping, President Jokowi, and they're tackling long overdue reforms, right? They're both exhibiting a great deal of political courage to do so. And around the world, from Italian Prime Minister Matteo Renzi to just elected Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, I think there's a new generation of leaders coming in.
Definitely,
right? And I think in coming years there will continue to be a turning of the political cycle, which will bring forward a new generation of leadership. So I think now is the time for us to decide what kind of leaders do we want? What kind of leaders do we want to be, right? And again, I think tragic events such as Paris remind us of the dangers of not being sincere leaders who genuinely care. I think if you're not, maybe you should reconsider whether you really want to go into politics or lead. Right?
The cynical perspective of politics, of course, is that politicians don't care. Certainly here in the Philippines, how do you find the balance between protecting the institution and being as idealistic? Wow, I think you've moved further towards, you've moved away from Mr. Spock and you're now moving towards embracing the things that are not rational or logical, correct?
True, true. That's maybe another maturation, right? I used to think that everything should just be rational.
Right.
And scientific.
They don't know. I used to call him Mr. Spock. But where do you find that balance between being cynical enough to protect a large institution that you head? I mean, you're part of the Indonesian government.
Well, one still has to be savvy.
Yes.
One still has to be realistic and a good manager. You have to be, sound management principles. You have to be astute and oftentimes still paranoid, right? Even because you are up against a lot of cynical people,
right?
Or people with ill intentions. Honestly, I think good sources of that balance are, of course, family.
Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. Family reminds you of what's actually important in life, and that's again another difference 15 years ago versus now, right?
Right.
I think once you start having a family, it just changes you completely, and you should allow it to change you completely. I think for societies and for many people around the world, religion
Yes.
is another excellent source of sincerity, genuineness, and from our former President Wahid,
Yep.
who was a
Muslim.
phenomenal Muslim cleric, right?
But not a very good president.
Yes, that's why sound management still applies. So you're right, you have to balance,
Yes.
right? One does have to be scientific and rational and logical and astute and a good manager, sound manager, but one also has to, keep one's heart and, one's sincerity and still care, right? So I think President Wahid was a great spiritual leader in the Islamic community, and now Pope Francis,
Yes.
right? I mean, look at the mental revolution that he's brought,
Right.
and of course President Jokowi is also trying to change mindsets, change attitudes, change the tone of the dialogue.
So I will go back to President Jokowi. Let's talk about APEC. I mean, you're talking about this balance that you're trying to find. What is your goal in APEC?
Maybe I would divide it into two parts.
Okay.
One is a bit mechanical and technocratic,
Okay.
right? And I think one thing which the president just underlined at the G20 yesterday,
Yep.
and which I'm here to underline, is about the global monetary architecture. I think most people understand that the world is overly dependent on the US dollar
Yeah.
as the minimum exchange, right? The US economy is about 20 to 25% of the world economy, but something like 70% of the world's currency reserves. The vast majority of trade and finance takes place in US dollars.
Right.
That's a big problem at a time of shrinking dollar liquidity, right? So dollars are becoming scarce and expensive all around the world for many reasons. And basically, I think economic leaders, political leaders have to make a concerted effort to change our habits, basically, right? To make greater use of euro, yen, and I think the big one is renminbi. I think
Interesting.
the Chinese renminbi is significantly underrepresented in global trade and global finance, right? And I think people don't fully appreciate the historical significance of the internationalization of the renminbi. So obviously it's been in progress, and it's hitting significant milestones now.
Interesting.
I think on November 30th, the IMF will announce that the renminbi will officially become part of what they call the special drawing rights, right, the SDR basket. It will become acknowledged as a global reserve currency together with the dollar, the euro, the yen, and the pound sterling. And to us in Indonesia, it's eminently obvious that to replace the retreating dollar liquidity, by far the most natural candidate is an incoming rush of renminbi liquidity.
This would have political impact, though. How would the U.S. react to something like
Actually,
this?
it's funny. The first people to endorse the internationalization of the renminbi was the UK, I believe, followed swiftly by Germany, followed swiftly by Korea. And then when President Xi Jinping recently visited the United States finally also came out in favor.
Interesting.
Right?
Okay.
And again, this is a bit mechanical, but over the last 2 years, the dollar has risen in value very sharply.
Yes.
It's up about 15% on a trade-weighted basis. It's causing a lot of pain for American multinationals, for American exporters, right? And if, for example, the renminbi came in, people, let's say, were to sell dollars and buy renminbi, it would actually cause the dollar to weaken again,
Right.
which would be much more comfortable for American multinationals and American exporters.
So
right?
it's balancing it a little bit, right?
Absolutely.
It's leveraging
And,
it.
I'm not forecasting that the renminbi will replace the dollar anytime soon. You know, I think the dollar might go from 70% of global reserves to maybe 60%. And the renminbi might go from 0 to maybe like 10%. But even that would make a huge difference, I believe.
Fascinating.
Huge difference.
Do you think that that would have an impact politically, or even in terms of the security matters that a lot of APEC will focus on?
I don't think so. I think, look, the more the renminbi gets out into the global economy, the more of a stake China has
in the global
economy.
Right, got it.
Right? And China will take its rightful place as one of the stewards of the global economy, which is appropriate given that they are, in nominal terms, the second largest, and in real terms, potentially already the largest economy in the world.
So,
right?
So you said that's your first one, the second one, so the global
I think the
monetary
second one,
architecture.
again, to me, what's quite revolutionary about President Jokowi is how he's changing the conversation, how he's changing the tone, right? And again, he's becoming more well-known around the world, and I expect he will become more well-known around the world. What people will notice is just his sincerity, his sincerity, his humility. And again, in light of the tragic events in Paris a few days ago, I think the importance of that sincerity, of that authenticity, to me, becomes very amplified. And because again, I think cynicism breeds disillusionment. And the antidote is very simple. Let's move away from the cynicism. Let's move away from playing games, right? On the trade front, let's be honest, we all talk about free and even fair trade, but what do we do in practice? The truth is, since the global financial crisis in 2008, most countries, including Indonesia, have been quietly rolling out protectionist measures.
Correct.
Right.
I'm so glad you said this, yes.
Well, again, I think the cynical approach would be to deny it or to cover it up.
Okay.
Or engage in a bunch of rhetoric.
Yes.
Right. But again, I think let's start by telling the facts,
By
the simple
admitting it.
truth, yeah.
Right.
And let's look at something else very factually, very honestly. Have these measures been helpful, right? For the last 3 years, global economic growth has been very weak. Emerging markets, which have probably been the most active in rolling out these protectionist measures, have seen their currencies collapse.
Go down, correct.
Right, go down.
Right.
So yes, there's other factors like monetary policy or technological shifts, changes in economic models that cause a economic transition in China. But I do believe that these protectionist measures or these business unfriendly measures that we've been rolling out do take their toll.
Are we going to see this change?
I think so. No, I think these things always go in waves.
Right.
Right. And
Because, I mean, interestingly enough, ASEAN, December 2015 is when there should be one ASEAN, right? And then this,
and there will be.
But yet, the measures in these countries, the Philippines, Indonesia, I mean, it hasn't actually said. The rhetoric is very different from practice. So I'm glad you pointed that out. So what are you going to do to change it?
Again, I think it starts with sincerity and just practical admission of the facts. What's also very helpful is regional competition.
Yes.
Right? I mean, who would have thought suddenly Vietnam and now potentially Myanmar are leading?
Correct.
You know, Vietnam in economic opening and economic modernization.
Right.
You know, and Myanmar now with political opening. I think Vietnam is stunning everyone by successfully wrapping a trade agreement with the European Union and simultaneously being part of TPP.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very bold, it's very courageous, and it's very advanced. It's very progressive, forward-looking. And I think countries like Indonesia, you know, maybe the Philippines, I have to be honest, I don't follow it that closely.
Yeah.
But certainly Indonesia, we have a choice. Do we follow or do we get left behind?
This is huge for Indonesia because you control 60% of the ASEAN economy. For you to do this or to change policy on it would pull the entire region.
Well, again, look, personally, I believe we're just going back to what the Indonesian culture is actually anyway. You know, we're not a defensive culture. We're not a closed culture. You know, we're not a culture of losers. You know, we're a culture of winners. We're a self-confident society. We're a confident society. We're full of success stories. You know, we're a large society, and we're an open society. You know, we have been for centuries.
Right.
You know, different cultures have passed through on the way from here to there. You know, again, we're a very diverse society, full of tolerance for each other. So our economic policy should be like that. Our trade policy should be like that, you know. I mean, there might be other countries that have a culture of being very closed, very defensive, but I just don't see where that applies to us.
Indonesia in the past has, aside from the creation of ASEAN, Indonesia for many, many years has been focused internally, it seems, right? And are we going to see a change now with the Jokowi administration?
I think so. I mean, look, the irony is that this is potentially an affliction that applies to many large countries, right? I mean, even the United States sometimes can be very tempted to turn inward because there's such a large domestic market, there's such a large domestic society, and you can get yourself busy just with your domestic affairs. And ironically, it's actually the smaller countries that feel they have nothing
to lose.
Well, and they feel they have no natural resources,
right.
Or they feel very vulnerable.
You're talking Singapore.
Well, you know, but many smaller countries actually end up becoming or being more proactive to go out into the world and search for information, search for the latest trends, reach out and form partnerships. I would argue even Thailand, for example, you know, does that very diligently, right? Korea, right? They really reached outward and very enterprising, you know, going out and looking for opportunities, developing opportunities. And it's oftentimes the large countries like, you know, India, Indonesia, you know, where it's very tempting a lot of times, or very easy for us to just turn inward, just because we have a large domestic society, a large domestic footprint, if you will.
This is exciting to hear. I mean, so let me just close APEC and then throw two more questions because I know that you also have limited time. I mean, in terms of APEC now, you had said earlier last week that you want to look at services, moving away from goods to services. And what do you want to walk out of this week with in Manila? What can we see?
APEC host country, Philippines, has put the services aspect on the agenda for APEC this year. And again, I think it is very forward-looking, very progressive. A lot of humanity's future is in services. Yeah. And in a way, it's time to take a broader perspective, right? So much of the political discourse tends to be about merchandise trade, right? Shipments of goods,
right?
Or oil and gas commodities, but services I think is underappreciated. So any progress we can make definitely towards greater acknowledgement, greater appreciation, and greater cross-border collaboration in services would be great.
And this is good for both of our countries. I mean, the largest dollar earner in the Philippines are its people.
Yeah, and I think if you remember that I'm quite a gadget freak.
Yes.
And,
I was
and
headed to technology next.
Technology, yes.
He's always been a gadget freak from forever.
So if you follow recent advances in technology and robotics, right, automation, the automation revolution is sweeping across the world.
Yes.
And lots of manufacturing may end up being automated.
Correct.
Right? In fact, a lot of low-end services might get automated. And I think what will always be relevant is things that require the human touch. Those are things which computers cannot do. Those are things which robots cannot do. And I think we need to focus on that.
How can technology jumpstart development in both our countries?
Well, that's an easy question. Sorry. Technology enables developing countries to leapfrog. Mm-hmm. People these days hardly remember a time when telephones used to be tethered to a cable, right? And we used to pick up a receiver that had a cable attached to it. And 30 years ago, we in the developing countries used to puzzle, well, how are we going to string up cables to our hundreds of millions of people?
Yes.
It's going to take forever.
Yes.
And then suddenly mobile phones came along, and developing countries went from single-digit telecom penetration to 80, 90, even 100% telecom penetration through mobile phones. Now, mobile devices, smartphones, tablets are enabling countries to leapfrog the personal computer entirely.
Right.
Jump from nothing straight to mobile tablets. So there's no question in my mind that technology enables developing countries to leapfrog,
yes,
right? To skip a whole generation of technology. Also, President Jokowi, another example, the way he revolutionized government services,
yeah,
and cut corruption is by moving a lot of processes from paper to online. Right? Once things are online, things are much more transparent.
Right.
Yes, of course, they can be hacked. Digital systems can still be manipulated, but they're much more likely to be caught or audited or, made transparent. So the move to online, I think, can revolutionize processes and procedures, and over time also simplify, right? Again, once everything's sort of online, you can see, my gosh,
yeah,
there's so many bloody steps.
Right,
It could
right,
be cut like
right.
6 out of these.
And that's where the manager comes in, right?
Exexactly. Execution.
President Jokowi has had the cynicism has increased tremendously from October last year until now, right? And how, I guess, for you, the challenges as a reformer now, I mean, how does President Jokowi and his administration deal with the cynicism that greets him now? He hasn't moved fast enough, hasn't gone far enough.
Right, right. At times like this, I like to say that the answer lies within, right? People have their religion, people have their family, people have their inner conscience. And, President Jokowi is a sort of leader who deeply believes in doing what is right. He said on many occasions, if I have to sacrifice my popularity, so be it, right? I'm here to do the right thing. And the other thing, so getting back to the sound manager and astute strategist, actually one thing a lot of politicians don't realize is that the payoff to reform is amazingly fast, right? So if you look at the European sovereign debt crisis that struck the continent 4 years ago, it finally persuaded governments in Spain, Ireland, Portugal, even Italy, France, to implement long overdue and controversial, even painful reforms. It took only 3 years for those economies to recover.
Right.
Today, only 3 years later, Spain is growing at a healthy clip. Ireland is practically booming, right? Portugal is out of the woods. Even Greece is finally recovering. And that only took 3 years. So I think one mistake that perhaps leaders make is within a political term, they wait too long, right? If you wait until year 2, year 3, year 4, it's too late because it takes maybe 2 or 3 years to see those fruits of those reforms, right? And
so you advocate the iterative approach of technology, push it out, and then iterate.
Yeah, I think, again, the other good thing about President Jokowi is he's very persistent.
Right.
He keeps pushing and keeps pushing. It's not like you try it once, gosh, this is so bloody difficult, forget about it, move on, right?
Right.
Like, he just keeps at it and keeps at it and keeps at it. That's why I think our infrastructure program is now finally succeeding.
Right.
It's because he keeps pushing and pushing and troubleshooting and troubleshooting and troubleshooting. And same with the deregulation now. We've hit a few roadblocks. We've had some backlash.
Right.
We're taking in the responses and the feedback. It's not easy, but the key is just keep pushing.
But
persistency.
The problems that you're trying to solve have been there for decades. I mean,
Right.
I'll zoom into one in particular, the haze. I mean, we were friends when I was trying to cover this out of Indonesia in the mid-90s, right? And the haze is still there. I guess, how do you deal with solving these very difficult, wicked problems and trying to do these reforms? And then the second part of that is really the haze, the economic impact of the haze today. So let's start first with with how do you deal with these huge problems?
Well, Maria, the phrase that comes to mind is an overnight success that is 30 years in the making, right? So,
what do you mean by that?
Well, a lot of successes seem like, oh my God, they solved it, right? But people only see the last 2 or 3 years of the solution.
The tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, tip of the iceberg. Actually, for example, the recent advances in cancer treatment, it's like, oh my God, it's amazing. They just did this in the last 2 or 3 years.
Right.
Actually, no. The last 2 or 3 years are the tip of the iceberg after 40 years of hard work and pain and research that people don't see. I think a good leader will take care of the job, right, during his or her tenure. A great leader will do that and additionally plant some seeds for the next generations, right? And many problems will not be solved in a single term or even in 2 terms. But, remember, we used to talk about this great concept the Americans have, which is pay it forward.
Yes.
Right. A lot of times we cannot pay back
Right.
The kindness, for example, given to us by our parents.
Yes.
Right. By the time we're able to, they're gone. It's too late. But what we can do is we can pass it on, right? And so, look, the current government, the current generation is benefiting from reforms or progress initiated by the previous generations. So we may not be able to solve certain problems immediately or even within our term, but we can start planting the seeds, or where seeds have been planted, we can continue nourishing those solutions, right? So that we hand over to the next generation progress that they can build on.
But certain problems like corruption, for example. I mean, in the 1920s, in the age of industrialization in the United States, all they did to kind of get rid of that was to come in and jail people, right? Put them in.
Which is what we're doing now.
Is that, so
Right.
do you see this? Law enforcement is coming in to deal with corruption?
I think it's an important part of the solution. And President Jokowi likes to point out how we've literally put dozens of governors and municipal regions and mayors into jail. We've put literally hundreds of civil servants into jail. But again, President Jokowi likes to look at the root of the problem. Right? It's the system, right? And then if you dig even deeper, underneath that system, there's an attitude.
Right.
Right? There's a culture. So you have to change the attitude. You have to change the culture.
So,
this is where I go back again to cynicism.
And again,
versus
that cynicism
sincerity.
was there early this year with KPI, right? And the police chief. I mean, was that just a hiccup? Do you see this?
I think President Jokowi's entry into office was the biggest leadership transition in 10 years.
Yes.
And his style is so different from his predecessor. And I do think, regardless of who would have ultimately won last year's election, I do think most Indonesians voted for a change.
Yes.
Right?
That was clear.
I think clashes or friction, like we saw between the Corruption Eradication Commission and the police, these are outward manifestations of change that is happening, right? Regeneration and rotation. What you can't do is status quo.
Understood.
Right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Let me bring you back to the Hayes question, the economic impact of Hayes, and what you'll tell your Southeast Asian allies today.
I actually think it's more a social and humanitarian issue. Yes, it does have economic impact.
Okay.
Turns out, surprisingly to me, it's been manageable because our economic numbers are showing moderate impact, but the humanitarian cost was unacceptable, and the environmental cost is unacceptable. Again, talk about what we pass on to the next generation. It's completely unacceptable. Again, we have to change attitudes, we have to change minds instead of thinking about the short term, right? Thinking about the quick hit, the quick riches or what have you. We have to foster a system that appreciates the longevity, the intergenerational aspect of society and economic policy.
That's fantastic. I have just one last question, and that is going back to you as a leader and what leadership demands today. I mean, from the time when we started talking about leadership 20 years ago to today, I mean, what has changed? What do you see as your greatest challenge now as a leader?
I think the key is to learn to be a good listener. And it's easily said.
Yeah.
If you really, really think about it, if you are thoughtful about it and observe it carefully, it's actually really hard. Very few people are genuinely good listeners that listen closely and
without cognitive
take
bias.
it in, but it's so powerful once you do it.
Oh my God, I can't let you go without asking you about TPP. TPP, President Jokowi surprised everyone by saying Indonesia would join. What does that mean for you?
Well, obviously it means a lot more work for me. But this is not yet kind of official policy or official position, but my personal take is it's a statement of self-confidence. TPP is very ambitious. TPP does promulgate the highest standards, the most modern, the most progressive practices. And what President Jokowi is signaling by saying we want to join TPP he's basically saying we want to be first class.
Yes.
We don't want to be second class, right? And much of the controversy in Indonesia has this undertone of, are we ready?
Yeah.
Can we do it? This is too difficult for us. And again, I just don't see why we should be thinking that way. We have so many success stories. We're one of the fastest growing economies, major economies in the world, right? Even with the slowdown,
Yeah.
right? We have one of the highest, maybe 5 or 7 highest economic growth rates in the world. Our society is well regarded, for our diversity, for our democracy, for our moderate Muslim practices, for our humor, right? For our inventiveness.
Yeah.
So I think we have every reason to be very confident that we can and we should aim for the highest standards.
Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us, everybody.